Forum Borealis. Paradigm Expansion.
Greetings from the north, citizens of the world. Welcome to Forum Borealis. Today, I have another compatriot with me to educate us on the dire state of our world economy. As I've pointed out in several shows, the current depression started half a year before the pandemic, but it got almost no mainstream press coverage. Sure, it was made worse by COVID, but why in the first place did the economy tank again? Well, when players fail upward and criminals are not only protected but rewarded, the whole system is per definition criminal. As we shall learn today, this is not just because gangsters have seized control, but simply a result of the economy being rigged in the first place. Now, there are different approaches to this fact with several potential solutions. One of them is to replace fiat money with a currency-backed system, which our guest tonight is in favor of. Hans-Erik Olav is a financier with a long background in international business who turned whistleblower and investigative economic journalist, a deed which did not go unpunished, as you will learn today. Born in Finland, grown up in Norway with a dual US-Norwegian citizenship, he went to Oslo Commercial College between 73 and 76. After military service, he studied BBS management at University of Georgia from 77 to 81 and MBA finance at University of Miami as an honor student from 82 to 83. He has participated in several sports, World Junior Championship of Golf in San Diego in 72, on a national senior level as Norwegian golf champion in 75, and 3 European championships between 75 to 77. Between 81 and 82 he worked for the Wilhelmsen Shipping Company in chartering, sales and purchase. Between 83 to 85, also in strategic planning, investment analysis, and as secretary for the board of directors. Between 85 to 86, he worked for Plateau Shipbroking and Finance. Between 86 to 89, he worked for Fernleys in project analysis, sales and building purchase, and between 91 and 93 as project finance, syndication, secured equity and mezzanine for Fernley Finance. He did worldwide syndication work involving major European and US banks and Japanese trading houses with project, investment and market presentations to numerous companies, such as Merrill Lynch, ABN AMRO, Hambro, Mitsui, etc. Between 93 to 99 he worked as shipping advisor and real estate investment for himself. Between 99 and 2015 he worked for Accelera Inc. as board of director member and chairman, involved in all facets of business development, operations and debt equity funding, including numerous convertible loans, was in charge of 12 investments in the Norwegian technology sector, totaling about $50 million, as well as responsible for market capitalization of $15 billion. Between 03 and 08, he also worked for Sebastian Holdings, financial asset portfolio with ships, offshore rigs and oil services, with initial investments of $125 million. And between 07 and 08, prior to the financial crisis, with disinvested portfolio for about $1 billion. He's been on many boards of directors, most notably Protegrity, Confirmit, Accelera and Sebastian Holdings. And on Thule Drilling, which hired him as a fixer, a savior, a commission he probably since regretted because it led him into a trap. Today, he is board of director for RAND AS and Argentus AS, as well as financial reporter. His journalistic career in the financial market has been parallel to his direct work experience in this field. Consequently, he's had numerous public and private presentations and lectures on subjects such as startups, state of affairs in the world and European economies and financial markets, and of course he's published numerous articles in Norwegian trade journal Dagens Næringsliv, in Ny Tid and other newspapers on issues like fractional reserve lending, quantitative easing, role of central banking, etc. A few examples of such articles herewith, titled Consequences of the Norwegian Oil Adventure, The Upcoming Financial Collapse, In Defense of the Greek People, Unsustainable Debt, Deutsche Bank and Dead Bank Directors, The New Fascism, The Pyramid Game of Banks and States, Behind the Panama Papers, The Bank Bluff, to name but a few. In his writings, Olav warns against our path to a dystopian future and exposes that the world's bank and finance institutions already are insolvent beyond hope, and that we are at the brink of complete economic collapse. He has had several broadsides against the current system and its players, exposing banksters' dirty laundry. No wonder he's suffered miscarriage of justice through an intricate process that he reports in his book The Great Deception from 2014, which also covers the topic of Norwegian and European failed economics, plus the present state of Norwegian and world economy and financial markets, criticizing the abuse of state power against liberty, welfare and legal protection. In his newest book, Farewell Human Being, in 2020, he exposes the path from the biological to the synthetic human, monetary power and the deep state's lies, fabrications and manipulations from Napoleon to Silicon Valley. And he has also accounted for his experience in a blog called The Thule Story Unplugged, as well as in his YouTube channel with videos detailing all the evidence of the collusion to bring him down. Albeit Hans Olav will share his story of their attempt to silence him at the end of this show, I will give you a summary with a survey of the case as an introduction to part 2. Enjoy. Welcome to Forum Borealis, Hans.
Thank you very much.
So, and by the way, welcome to society. Welcome back to society,
Well,
to the free world.
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, as people will hear, we're going to go back to your story, but you have been, it's like a movie. In my view, you've been rigged, set up, and miscarriage of justice, and that period of your life is just gone. But like people heard, you've been a very resourceful writer about economic subjects, and we've had several economic shows lately.
Okay.
We've covered the black economy, we've covered the crisis, the pandemic, or the crash that actually happened right before the pandemic. And I have to say, in the magazine New Time, we had the editor, is that what they call it? Redacteur, editor?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, we had him on last week. But in that magazine, you've had several articles warning about what's going to happen. You were a couple of years early out. But you said economical crisis ahead was one article. You said the economy will collapse. You said Ragnarok on its way. Ragnarok is the Norse judgment day. You said, and this is, I want to ask you about this in the show today. Economic collapse, could it be Norway's salvage? You have also one called the Doomsday Prophets Increases. More and more experts realize a collapse will come. And then it came, maybe after you came out. Actually, you've been in during the whole Corona time too.
No, I've been at home, but I was in prison for up until April, May.
Well, okay.
From April, May, I've been at home, and I've been out working every day. So it's been sort of like a semi-free situation, if you will.
Right. But this, it really started the Corona in, I think, February, March. You should be happy you got out of the prisons, because they are very infectious areas, of course.
Yes, I'm happy about that. I was actually very lucky, because there was a bit of a panic in the criminal justice system at that time, and I pressed very hard to try to get out, and for a few weeks there they were very uncertain about how they should handle the situation with the pandemic, or the so-called pandemic.
Yeah.
And I was lucky to be able to go home.
Yeah.
And then they closed the doors, so to speak, so that all other people who could have gone home were prevented from that.
Oh,
so, yeah.
Damn. Because in many countries they have let out prisoners before the time also, and some just temporary. But that was in the beginning. They didn't know how to handle it. Now I'm going to read the title of some of your articles so people know what we're going to discuss today.
Okay.
It's all related. You have one article here called A Gigantic Pyramid Scheme. And that's your commentary to the book Sabotage, The Business of Finance. Very interesting book. So we're gonna discuss a little those matters. You have another article called Cash Free and Totalitarian. I guess the title says it all. Mm-hmm. Then you have one called Deutsche Bank and the Dead Bank Directors. You have one called Fully Rotten and Entirely Normal. Mm-hmm. That's and a very famous quote it starts with: if people understood how the banking system works, it will be revolution tomorrow. That's Henry Ford.
That's...
It's a commentary to the book Swimming with Sharks. And then you have one article called The Bank Scheme.
Yeah.
And you have one called The Bank and the Pyramid Game of the State. So, I think we could begin in this end, and which will be kind of a continuation of a former show. We had a chap on, we talked about what's called modern monetary theory. I bet you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
And I think the guy who launched it, Richard Werner, I really like his analysis, but people misunderstand and think MMT is like a policy. Well, the reality of MMT is implemented as a policy for the elite, of course, never for the people. If it's for the people, then we can't afford it. But if it's for the oligarchs and the multinational corporations, no problem. Let's loot their treasure. And so we see that they push the bill, so to speak, into the future. But it's not just time that makes MMT possible for them to apply. It's also space. If you could expand endlessly in space as in time. In time, it's in the future, right? And in space, you could say, well, if we start mining, let's say the moon or meteorites or even other planets in the future, it will kind of have the same principle as when you postpone it in time. So if you can just spend whatever you need to now, then the bill is kind of transferred to whatever will come in the future, or in the distance in time, or in the distance in space, so to speak. So that's how I, in my layman words, would explain how they can. And as long as, my guest also said another thing, I want you to comment. He said that as long as it's not tied to the consummation of resources, they can get away with it. As soon as this is tied to consummation of resources, then it will immediately collapse the economy. I mean, the MMT practice. So what's your thought about this?
Well, what I try to do when I write these articles, I try to do it from an historical perspective. And if you start talking about the fiat money system, which is what is at the root cause of the problems we have in the world today, of course, the fiat currency system, fiat is not really money; it's just currency. And if you look at the fiat currency system today, you have to look at the historical, what should I say, backdrop to this. And it all started in 1910 when Senator Aldrich took some of the most influential and rich bankers in the world down to Jekyll Island. I'm sure you've heard of that story.
Infamous story.
Yeah. And Jekyll Island, they concocted a scheme in order to hijack the whole monetary system from the people and privatize it into their own private banks. And therefore, they called it, and there was a big discussion about how they could sort of lure the people into accepting this. And that's the reason for the name, the Federal Reserve Banking System. It sounds very official. It sounds very sort of like democratic and so forth. But of course, it's a scam.
Yeah.
And exactly like Henry Ford once said, if the people knew how the banking system really works, it would be a revolution tomorrow. What this is, and the reason for them doing this is because they saw that quite a large number of banks were being established mainly in the US, and they were scared of their oligopoly situation. They wanted to monopolize the banking system as much as possible. And if you look at it today, I think we're at the end of the road where they're really trying to put the final nail in the coffin in order to control everything.
So would you say that they realize that the jig is up and now they're trying to transition into a situation where they will not be held accountable, but where they will maintain control? Is that kind of an incentive among the elites?
I think that there are two big players out there today. One is the backers of the fiat money system, which of course started with the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Aldrich and the Morgans and the the Warburgs, who were behind the meeting at the Jekyll Island. And the other are the ones that would like to go back to sort of like people's money system, which is a gold-based system.
Yeah, like Ron Paul and many libertarians. And I'm assuming also those, just a little detour, what about Bitcoin? Where does that fit in? Isn't that kind of a fiat money too?
Well, Bitcoin...
All crypto coins, I mean.
Well, I'm actually, the more I read and learn about Bitcoin, the more uncertain I become about the value and the use of Bitcoin, and if indeed it will be the people's money, so to speak, because in general terms, cryptocurrencies is a liberating type of money system because it's for the people. There is no banking control, there is no government looking over the shoulder and seeing what you're spending your money on and things like that. So in that sense, it's a very liberating scheme or money system. But what puzzles me with Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies is that there is seemingly no opposition or fight against it from the powers that be.
That's suspicious in itself.
Yeah, that's suspicious in itself, because one would have thought that they would try to do something to stop Bitcoin. Now there are rumors that the elites, meaning the bankers, have already acquired control over Bitcoin. Who knows? I don't. But we could have a situations where they, hopefully in desperation, try to make this digital currency And the digital currency, in my opinion, would be something like the SDRs. That's a special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And if they do that, and they have the power, ultimately a military power, to just tell people that it's illegal to trade in bitcoins or in any other cryptocurrency, then the question becomes, is that possible? Can they stop a sort of decentralized system from existing? It's kind of like if you want to ask if you forbid people smoking marijuana, how do you do that? How do you enforce it? It's impossible, isn't it? Because you can't stop people from drinking or smoking pot in their own homes. So it's kind of difficult. You could, of course, impose the death sentence and hope that you could stop it.
And camera in every living room.
Yeah. So I think the judgment on the cryptocurrencies is still out there. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out. But for certain, I don't expect the current bankers, having had control of the banking system and money for quite a few hundred years, are willing to simply let that power go. They're going to put up a fight. I'm not exactly sure how they'll do it.
Well, certainly the shadow side of crypto coins is horrible, and that's a centralized blockchain system. And, I've just read, and this sounds like, if you go back a couple of decades, if you take the most extreme Christian fundamentalist conspiracy theory, is now on print in the Bank of England. They say that they want, or they suggest or something like that, it's a few months since I read it, and Richard Werner speaks about it too, that they are saying that people should have a chip. If they accept the chip, that could be connected to this centralized blockchain system controlled by the big banks, and then they could get UBI, which is a principle I kind of support if it's real UBI, like completely without condition. You know what I mean with the UBI, right? Borgarlön.
Yeah.
And so, but in order to be eligible to receive it, this is the banking scheme version, then you need this chip, and it's all going to be digital. And we don't need the movies depicting this story to understand the horror of it, right? People like you, you're talking too much about banking secrets, let's delete his account or something. It's that easy.
No, what you're talking and describing there brings us right back to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, written in 1932, and the revision, I guess, back in the early 1960s, and to George Orwell's 1984. And according to Aldous Huxley, we're in the final chapter now where we have succumbed to these forces, and we accept them gladly. We accept our servitude gladly because we've been drugged, so to speak, by this propaganda machine for many, many years. And we don't see what's coming. We don't see the kind of 24/7 surveillance society that they're bringing upon us because we're too busy looking down at our phones and twittering and writing messages and talking about our life on Facebook.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty shrewd scheme. But if you go back, you look at the Bank of England. It was in 1694 that the Bank of England was established by King William, and he did it in order to finance the wars against France and also the war in the colonies. And that was the first time that the banking system and the politicians went to bed with each other. So they printed money. That was the Fiat system, of course, and they used half of the money to finance the wars, and half of the money, the shareholders, which was the king himself and his closest associates, they lent it out to people for interest. And since then, they've been in bed together.
You said Jekyll Island was in 1910, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So was the economy up to that point based on actual value, like gold and stuff like that?
Well, the history is such that it's gone back and forth. We've had, I would say that we've had maybe more than 1,000 different fiat money or currency systems throughout history, going back 4,000, 3,000 years. But they've all broken down. They've all collapsed, each one of them. So, but it's gone back and forth, and we've actually had several attempts in the USA to establish a Federal Reserve Bank. At least 2 other attempts before the Federal Reserve, which failed. So, yeah. So, but the fact of the matter is that no fiat system survives. I think there's more than 1,000 fiat systems throughout history that have been raised and perished, and they all collapse because it's a pyramid scheme, and it goes on until the legs of the pyramid cannot hold it any longer, and then it collapses. And the average age of the fiat system is sort of like 35 to 40 years. And this one, we're into 50 or 55 years or even 60, depending on which date you pick.
Yeah, yeah.
So we are overdue for a collapse. And when people say that they're happy that we have 0 or negative interest rates, and we print money like there's no tomorrow, people get the illusion that you can have value for nothing. You can get money for nothing, and you can get this borgerlønn, as we call it, and everything is fine. But the point is, if helicopter money, just dropping money from the sky, or just having a digital wallet where the government gives you money, and it's all for free, and you don't have to work, then if that's okay and that builds values, then why not just do a lot more of it?
Yeah, but that's not UBI. So the thing is, like Norway today, we have a huge, as you know, I don't know the English word, but it's the welfare state. It's the different kinds of trygd. How would you translate that to English?
Well, it's a joint welfare system from cradle to grave, where where different interest groups are given privileges in order to keep them sedated from any kind of responsibility for their own lives.
But here's the point. Like you said, from cradle to grave. And the cost of such a bureaucracy is humongous. And UBI would save so much money for a country like Norway. We would get rid of, first off, we would get rid of that nanny state mentality that Norwegians are suffering from, because for all the advantages of having a trygd system, we call it trygd, is like, it's not really social security, but it's different kinds of securities that the state gives. But in order to be eligible, you have to be like a client, you have to be like a, you're not a customer, you're not an equal, you're just a cog in the big machine. And then there's salaries for all the people who facilitates this, from controllers to payers to, there's a billion jobs connected to it too. And it would be so much more effective to get rid of all that stuff and just implement the UBI. And then you would say, where will the money, first off, tests with UBI shows that people don't stop working. In fact, all they do, often what happens is that they start doing jobs that are not accepted in the current rigged economic system as sustainable or viable economically. But these are jobs that has to be done. And so people do those things. And of course, it also helps those who have very low salary to get stuff around. So if we started from scratch, we didn't have to discuss solutions like UBI, but we're not starting from scratch. We're starting in such a rigged and corrupted system that we need a way out. And we see that today in America, where you're probably aware that half the people are soon without housing, and people are losing their jobs, or they're taking pay cuts, and America is due for collapse, actually.
Well, I think the United States is in the sixth and final stage of the fall of an empire, pretty
Yes.
much like the Roman Empire, unfortunately.
But the silver lining, I think, is that when America collapses, it will force a change for better or worse, because they've been calling the shots globally for so long. And if their people rises up, there is hope if they can clean their own system. But let's take a couple of small issues first. Why is cash-free totalitarian, just for those who haven't got that?
Well, it's the effect of a cash-free society is that everything is digital, and if you have a digital money system, you automatically can follow each and every person's use of that digital cash. So if you are not free anymore. Now, if you spend $100 in you send $100 to the Red Cross, or if you spend $100 on a prostitute, they will know about it. So it's essentially an unfree world, because and then they can of course go further and like some people say, if you want to see the future, look to China. In China, they are already experimenting with this, where they have this chip that they implant. And they follow every move you make, and you get a scorecard, sort of like a social scorecard. And if you have a digital currency, you can very easily implement a social scorecard. So let's say you do things that lowers your score. Well, then you can be penalized by the state in many different ways. You can go into a store, try to buy something, and you get to the counter, and you say your social scoring does not. Actually prohibits you from buying this product, or it could get even worse than that. So it's really the essential battle between complete government totalitarian control of each and every citizen. That's what we're talking about. And that's what, unfortunately, people don't seem to realize.
No, it's true. And of course, with cash-free society, there's also control over money. They only become numbers in a computer, and then you could say, well, who's accessing the control system of the computers, right? So they can basically, the elites will they can seal themselves off forever.
Yeah.
From the people. Forever.
Well, we pretty much have a digital banking system already. I mean, when you go into a bank and you say, I want to borrow $1 million to buy a house, they don't have that money. I mean, they create it. They create credit. Now, it's only the central banks that can create money, but the private banking system, they create credit. They don't have the money for your house. They create it just by typing some figures into a computer, and they say, here you go buy the house. And then you have to pay them back the $1 million plus interest on money that didn't exist, shouldn't exist, and that they shouldn't give you. This is the giant scam that Henry Ford was talking about.
So when you call it a pyramid scheme, could you try to dumb down and explain how a pyramid scheme works for those who don't know it? Because, I mean, everybody knows the notion, but I'm not so sure everybody understands the mechanism of it.
Well, the right term for it is fractional reserve banking or fractional reserve lending, and fraction being a smaller part of something bigger. It would take too long to explain the whole system. I would probably need a blackboard to draw it all out. But
hang on. Are you familiar with the cartoon online in 3 parts called Money as Debt?
I'm afraid I'm not, but I'm familiar with Mike Maloney's series on the hidden secrets of money, which should be seen in every university and every school, I think. So
you can find that on YouTube, right?
Yeah, Mike Maloney's Hidden Secrets of Money, and in particular, I believe episode 4 or 5, where he talks about this pyramid scheme, is excellent. I've got a video out on YouTube about the system, but I have to say Mike Maloney explains it far better than I do. And it's basically a pyramid scheme because you leverage the money that you are able to access from the central banks, and when, for example, you put your salary into a bank account and say that is 100, let's say it's $100, they will lend out, and if the requirement for security for your money is say 10%, they'll lend out 90, and the next time they'll lend out 81 and retain 8 with the central bank. So what they do is they actually lend out your money
10 times over?
10 times or 20 times over. But as a matter of fact, they can do it almost without limit, because most banks don't have reserve requirements anymore. They have requirements about how their equity should be. And anybody that knows anything about cooking the books knows that they can play around with their own balance, and they can play around with their accounts, and they can make it look any way they want. So they can virtually lend out as much as they like. It's almost limitless, and this is money that, of course, they haven't got. And your security for this is minimal. So there's maybe they have liquid reserves of between 3 to 5%. And some banks don't even have that. So when 3.5% of the population or the savers go to their bank and say, we want our money out, there's nothing left. And then, of course, you have bank runs. And this is what happened back when Lehman Brothers collapsed back in 2008, is when there was a strain on liquidity. It's exactly because of the fractional reserve lending system, and which is extremely important for people to understand, because if Deutsche Bank, who is priced by their shareholders as being a bank that should be turned in for liquidation, that's how the shareholders view Deutsche Bank. If Deutsche Bank goes down, we're talking numbers much, much bigger than Lehman Brothers. And when Lehman Brothers collapsed, we were only 2-3 hours away from a total collapse of the whole financial system. Now, the reason for all of this back in 2007, 2008 was debt. And at that time, the total debt in the world was about $105 trillion. And the system almost collapsed. Well, in 2020, the debt has increased to 285 trillion.
Jesus, 285.
So it is just a matter of time before this collapses, because it has to collapse because of the pyramid scheme. And we saw the start of the collapse back in September last year, when the repo market, which is the repurchase market for banks, the overnight lending market, started having the same kind of problems they had back in 2007 and 2008.
Yeah.
Well, this time the Federal Reserve, they were better prepared. But the problem is that...
Hang on. By better prepared, presumably you're meaning that they had managed... After 2008, there was they implemented a new rule that said that you do not need the politicians' approval, I'm assuming Congress approval, to print money out of thin air and pump it into the market, which they had to do then. They had to get the... and so what happened last autumn and all the way into spring before the corona is that they pumped trillions into the market directly without going through. So there was very little press about it. Of course, the press is bought and paid for. And there was very little political oversight. So basically what they've done is that they've taken the collective means that supposedly belongs to the people, you and me, and they have just, pumped like a machine gun into the markets.
Yes, they have. Now, how much of that money that they've pumped into the market actually is being used? That's a big question, because a lot of this is psychology. It's the illusion of the Fed being able to solve every problem there is, and some of the money is not even used. But if you go back to if you go back to the federal, when the Federal Reserve Board was thought of back in 1910, in order to make that system work, they had to have a lender of last resort or a payer of last resort. And there's no coincidence that the Internal Revenue System and the income tax was established in the same year that the Federal Reserve Bank was established, because ultimately it's the taxpayer, you and I and everybody else, that end up paying the bills for all these rich bankers when the system breaks. And of course, the bankers know that it will break because they've done it so many times before, that they know that the system ultimately breaks because it's a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme. So they had to have some kind of lender of last resort to bail them out. And that is you and I, the taxpayers. And again, coming back to Henry Ford's statement about if we really knew what was going on, there would be a revolution. And there should be one, because people need to open their eyes to see these banks for what they really are.
Yeah, and we're going to get back to solutions. But yeah, it's like you say, they privatize the gains and they socialize the losses. Like in American lingo, it's called corporate socialism. It's like there's going to be no risk for us corporations are people, of course, only when it comes to rights, not when it comes to duties. And not only are corporations people, but we'll be welfare queens. You're going to subsidize us, you're going to bail us out, you're going to let us do all these dirty things that when they do get the bailouts, they're not using it to make the market healthier. They're using it for stock buybacks and profits and lots of bullshit. And so, yeah, give us the collective money and never punish us for anything. So let us do crimes, help us do crimes, give us incentives to do crimes, reward us for doing crimes, pay us for doing crimes, and if we screw up everything for everyone, then pay us even more and help us continue, whereas punish the victims, the people. That's basically the philosophy of what's going on, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's pretty close. The ones that are being hurt the most are the people, the savers, which in large part are the people that are either already pensioned or about to be pensioned, and of course their future generations. When the Federal Reserve pumps $3.5 trillion into the economy, which has to be paid back at some point, what they're doing is criminal against the coming population, the unborn child. They're actually levying a huge tax on unborn children that has no say in in assuming all this debt. So it could be called a crime against humanity, really, because people, unborn children, come into this world with a huge debt on their shoulder, and they've had no say in how that debt was acquired, and they've had no say in agreeing and accepting this debt. So it's really a crime, and you could say that it's run by a crime syndicate, I guess, would be appropriate word for it.
Yeah, only that they are dressing in smokings, not in masks. So, but you know, Jeremy Irons, he said, the actor, a British actor, he said back in the recession, he said that, and you said we now owe, the debt is 285 trillions. Yeah. Whatever the number was back then, he said, okay, let's say he used that number. So he would say then, okay, so the world is owing 285 trillions. But if that's the debt, we have to owe it to someone. Who are these bastards? Can they please enter the scene? Maybe we could hang them or something. I mean, if there's a debt, isn't there also a debtor, someone who collects?
Well, yes, supposedly, and that's what's missing from most of the discussions among the Keynesian economists, who think that you can just scratch the debt and be done with it. Well, of course you can't, because for every debtor there is a creditor and vice versa. So you can't... Who
are the creditors for these 285 trillion?
The creditors?
Yeah.
Well, much of the creditors would be a lot of it is pushed into the future as debt to be paid by the citizen, and the creditors, well, they're all over the place. I mean, it's all debt. It could be associated with real estate. It could be associated with buying stocks, bonds, whatever, because everything is leveraged. That is, when a creditworthy client that has millions in the bank or even billions in the bank gets access to this cheap money, he spends not much of his own money. He borrows the money in order to invest more and make even more millions to its portfolio. So it's sort of like a vicious circle, if you will.
So he borrows money, but it has to be the banks at the end of the day who collects.
Well, that's why at the root of the problem, at the root of what's going on now under the pandemic, where people are losing their jobs, and you will see foreclosures in the real estate market, and you will see a lot of bad things happen for the common man. Ultimately, all of this filters down into the banks, which is why ultimately the banks will collapse. So you'll probably, I mean, in Europe, the banks are even worse off than in the States. In the 740 some banks in Italy, for example, between 25 and 30% of the loans are bad. I mean, they're not being paid, and they're being just extended. But there comes a time when they can't be extended anymore. You have Deutsche Bank, who's got $40 trillion in derivatives. That's about almost half the total gross national product of the world, just in derivatives.
Wow.
And if you read, you mentioned earlier the article that I wrote about dead banksters.
Yeah.
Where Deutsche Bank is involved with the Monte dei Paschi, the oldest bank in the world. I mean, they used the derivative schemes to try to prop up the balance sheet and make things right at Monte dei Paschi, who was about to go bankrupt. And they worsened the situation, and that's when they needed to cover it up, and all these suspicious deaths occurred.
So what's that about? Could you give some meat to that bone? Who's killing them, and why are they being murdered?
Well, let me rephrase that. I'm not gonna say that they were murdered. It's just suspicious deaths, I would call it.
No.
People should make up their own minds about if this is something really bad or not. But I have my own opinion, of course, about that. But when more than 70 banksters, bank directors, sort of die mysteriously or commit suicides, there has to be something behind it. I mean, it just doesn't happen without a reason.
And it's happening within a certain span of time, obviously.
Yeah. So, by the way, this is I got this from an article by this guy called Tucker, who I'm pretty sure writes for Casey Research. So people can look it up there. But I just thought it was interesting to see how far, this system will go in order to protect themselves. And history tells us that there's really no limit to what they'll do.
This old bank, Monte dei Paschi, is that in the Vatican Bank? What is that bank? MDP?
I don't have detailed knowledge of who the shareholders or who controls the bank, but
so it's just a normal Italian bank?
Well, it's a very old, prestigious Italian bank, and whether it's associated with the Vatican, I don't know, but
okay.
One would assume that it is.
I mean, the widow of one of them, Rossi, she says straight out that he knew too much.
Yeah.
So if we want to be like detectives here, we're going to create a hypothesis to see if this is some kind of shakedown going on in the criminal world of mafioso banking. Then what would the hypothesis be?
Well, the hypothesis would be that this derivative scheme that they applied in order to save Monte dei Paschi from going bankrupt has a criminal side to it that cannot be brought into the public's eye. And when things went from bad to worse, and it was difficult covering this up, then you need to silence those who perhaps could or are tired or scared of covering it up from saying anything. And so that would be the hypothesis, that they knew too much, and we need to keep this under wrap, and therefore we need to sort of silence them. That would be the hypothesis if you were a detective, I guess.
Yeah, but we would have to go further. We would have to find the suspects. And if it's the bank directors, like in the case of David Rossi, he should have, according to your article, the claim is that he's jumping backwards out the window of his office with blue marks on both his arm and a deep cut from a weapon in his head, and then he landed 10 meters further down on his back. So obviously it's a murder in my eyes, but we need to know who has done it. So if it was just like a bank functionary, someone in the middle of the system who wanted to blow the whistle, sure, we could suspect the bankers, but this is the chief of the bankers. So if they kill him, it's because if he knows too much and they kill him for that, it's because they can't trust that he won't talk. So obviously he's been threatening to talk. So who is afraid? I don't think it's the shareholders. I think this smells of intel industry, or the banking industry. It's like those who have an interest in maintaining the system. I often say, imagine the elites like a mafia system, because in a mafia system there will be infighting between families for control. We're trying to take over each other's territory. We're always competing, right? But on the same time, if there's a exterior threat, the FBI or something is after them, then they all band together to survive because they know they're in it. They're in the same ship, so to speak. And that's how I regard this too, that there are people who have interest to keep this dirty, rigged system going. And if, the top of a bank is killed, nobody's above him in the bank. So there's nobody in his bank who would do this. It would have to be people who have a common interest to keep it like that. Or the bankers, or the intel system, which is facilitating and embed CIA into banking and all that stuff. So that's what I'm thinking. What do you think about the perps?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think that any system like that, for it to work, like you call it mafia system, it would need to be compartmentalized pretty strictly, so that you only, on a need-to-know basis. Yeah. And obviously, you have to go to the very top for these tragic events to be decided and for them to take place. But difficult to speculate exactly where you find a perpetrator, but I think it's pretty near the top of the pyramid. It would have to be.
And that points to the central banks.
Yeah, I would say so. And the central bank, so the central bank is the Bank of International Settlements in Basel.
The old Nazi bank, yeah.
Yeah. I think that bank is at least rumored to be even higher up the chain of command than the Federal Reserve. So.
Well, it's interesting because Richard Werner said that the solution for all this crap is small community banks. He didn't abandon the whole banking system. He says that, and he's the first one who, because all the economists are just theoreticians. They're sitting behind their desks and they're concocting up philosophies. And some are valid, some are not. But he's done the first scientific research, and he's proven that small community banks, decentralized bank, local banks, are what's actually saving the economy. That's what's generating the plus in the economy. And then he says that obviously central banks, but also big banks, national banks, banks that are into this gambling system, that are playing around with what's it called, derivatives and stuff like that, who are doing completely unoverseen betting on failed loans and all that stuff that was involved in the recession, and which is going on now too, even worse. He said that those are the banks that making the toxicity in the system, and that and he also said that that's the reason of why both China and Germany is doing so well. It's because, like Germany, I think he said 80% of the banks are local community banks. Your view on that?
Well, I agree with his assessment that the big banks and the
research, not assessment.
Research that if it shows that the big banks are the toxic ones. So I agree with that, because I mean, if you look at the fractional reserve lending system, to come back to that, because it's so important to understand, if you have a society where you are all of a sudden you want to have a government, and for that purpose you hold elections, and the ones who promise the most to the people wins. Then they after that is done, you have a finance department, you have an environment department, you have an agricultural department, and so forth. Well, the treasury or the finance department, they have to make do on those promises that they made to the people about building roads and what have you, schools. But they have no money starting out. So where do they get their money? Well, they issue a bond, a debt certificate that they send via the big banks over to the Federal Reserve or the central bank. And the central bank is then supposed to buy that loan. I'm saying buy in hyphens. So, but the federal bank has no money either. So what do? Well, they write a worthless check for, let's say, for 100 million, and they send it back to the treasury via the banking system, and whoops, all of a sudden the treasury has 100 million that they can spend on roads. I mean, that's how money is created out of thin air. And then that money gets into the system, and that's when the banks get a hold of the money, and they can leverage, and they can lend out what's in your savings account or in your payment account 10 times, 20 times, or almost limitless. So that's where it becomes toxic.
So, in other words, if you have some savings, you should really convert them to something tangible, like houses, what's it called, possessions, or like gold, evergreen value stuff. Well, because if at the end of the day your bank account is the vulnerable, what we call salderingspost, I don't know the English word, but if it all collapses, at the end of the day it will reach your bank account, and what was worth 1 million will be worth 1,000 eventually. It's not safe.
Well, the thing is, when the banking system collapses, because it will collapse, then first, of course, your savings account and your account where you get your salary into disappears. Okay, and that's where the bank guarantee comes into play. In Europe, you're supposed to have a guarantee for each deposit bank account. You're supposed to have a guarantee of some 100,000 euros. And in Norway, it's 2 million kroner, which is a little bit more than 200,000 euros. The point is that if you look at the balance sheet of the Guarantee Institute and the people, or the ECB or whatever, that guarantees this in Europe, and the Guarantee Institute in Norway, they don't have that kind of money. They have less than 3% of what they're actually guaranteeing to the depositors or the clients of the bank. So there is an illusion that you will get your money, but you won't. You will get nothing. And because it's all been spent. It's been spent by the bank for lending out for houses and what have you to keep the real estate bubble going. And they spend a lot of the money on their own investments. Like they're in a casino in Las Vegas. They spend your money. So what happens? And this is why the Federal Reserve in America was established at the same time that the income tax was, because they needed a lender or somebody to save them of last resort, which of course then brings us back to the taxpayers and the citizens of each country.
Yes,
they are the ones who end up with the bill.
So at the end of the day, the state will go in and take over and say, we guarantee for each bank account, and they will have to use the resources of the state. So if the state is poor, there's limited what they can do. If the state has resources like Norway, at least as long as the oil is going, then they can bail it out. But
the point is that Norway don't really have the resources. Norway is really a very poor country from an economic standpoint.
Why is that? Explain that.
Well, Norway has an economy where after a productive worker who is a net tax contributor has paid for his own social services, he has to pay for 3 other Norwegians who are net tax collectors. And so that equation is a hopeless equation, because it doesn't equate. You can't have a system where you and I, if we are productive, have to pay for 3 or 4 other people after we paid for ourselves. So the social welfare system with all the privileges is really a broken system. Now, on top of that, you look at the current liabilities for pensions and medical services and stuff like that into the future, and you will see that the commitment to pay those liabilities is higher than the total value of the oil fund, and it's growing by 400 to 500 billion kroners each year. So the money has been spent. I mean, it's gone now
because it's tied up to pensions.
It's tied up to that. Then recently we also found out that the water system in Norway is totally broken as well. More than 75% of the water is running through pipes that are more than 75 or 80 years old, and 75% of the water never reaches its destination. And the estimated cost of that is could go as high as a total Norwegian national budget. Although the sum they're mentioning now is like 300 to 400 billion kroner, everyone knows that if that's the starting point, it's going to get a lot more expensive than that.
Yeah. So,
and then you add to this the fact that before the pandemic broke, or the so-called pandemic broke, 70% of the listed companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange needed additional liquidity to survive. 70%. So, and you add to that the main trading partners of Norway have a cost level 50% lower than Norway. You can very easily draw the conclusion that Norway is hopelessly in the hole when it comes to productivity and when it comes to paying its bills in the future, and having money for the people to live a decent life. So
yes, we're very vulnerable for this global collapse.
Completely, we're completely in the hands of the banksters. Yeah.
So because people don't know. Obviously, most of our listeners are not Norwegian, but Norwegians know that they have been closing down primary production, like landbruk, what's that in English?
Agriculture.
Agriculture and stuff like that, on expense of oil for everything. And then they have used the oil money. Yes, lots of it is in stocks, and that can become zero overnight. But lots of our oil money is also in hard assets, like they bought up, I think, Champs-Élysées in France.
Yeah, they probably did.
That's actually one of the better things they've done, right? I mean, you would want hard assets for a rainy day.
Of course you do. I mean, this is like the industrial magnate Stinnes did in connection with the Weimar Republic back in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
He saw what was coming when the Weimar Republic started printing money like crazy, just like the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank is doing now. And he knew that it spelled disaster. So he did precisely that. He bought, just like Warren Buffett's been doing. You buy a railroad, and then you buy everything that's close to the railroad that are hard assets, like mining companies and agriculture and stuff like that.
Mm.
And then you try to finance everything in the currency that is printing all this money, because you know that currency is going to die.
Right.
So when you have to pay it back, you can simply pay it back a dime on the dollar, so to speak, because you've been smart and you've realized that the best is to finance in a currency that's going to go out of business.
Yeah, but that's what we've seen been going on in America too now. It's like, and now I'm talking even about the Corona crash that accelerated the crash that already begun. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that people are forced to sell their homes, or they're not even selling it themselves, the banks are doing it, and so those who have money of resources to buy up now, they are getting stuff for a dime at the dollar, as you say, and so they will become a new superclass when this is reset.
Well, this is history.
Or it's not a new one, it's the old one, but they're even more richer, and we are even more poorer. Yeah. Isn't that a correct analysis?
Yeah, well, this is history repeating itself.
On steroids.
Every economic and financial collapse is really about transferring of wealth, okay?
Right.
And it's exactly what happened back in 1929 when the Great Depression broke. In 1927, Montague Norman, the central bank chief of the Bank of England, went anonymously on a boat over to New York, and he called himself Professor Skinner. Mm-hmm. And the reason for his anonymity was because he was meeting up with the central bankers of France and Germany, and then Mr. Strong, who was running the Federal Reserve at that time. And in 1927, they had the same situation as we had, say, maybe 3-4 years ago, in terms of all this printing of money and preparing the way for a collapse, which we've so far avoided. But anyway, they decided that they were going to collapse the economy. They decided they were going to collapse the financial markets back in 1927. Mm. Now, according to the history books, the German banking chief walked out of the room together with the French. They wouldn't have any part of it. But the Brits and the Americans, they decided we're going to crash the market. But before they crashed the market in 1929, they gave all the people who were insiders the chance to get out. Mm. And they got out. And what happened when everybody else had to go and sell? Well, they picked it up for a dime on the dollar. Mm. So this is what happens in a collapse, that the richer get even richer.
So do you think
the insider wins? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think they're now realizing they can't keep this going anymore? So let's just pop a hole on the bubble.
I think that I've been saying for some time that it's going to collapse, and I know that I'm right. I just haven't been right about the timing.
That's true.
Because I didn't realize they could rig the system for so long. Mm. But you should listen when the people who are running the system speaks. And that's why you should listen when the IMF comes out, like they did a couple of weeks ago, and they repeated this message now several times, is that they're preparing for a collapse. They're not saying outright that we will have one yet, but they are in between the lines. They're saying it's going to be very, very difficult. We're entering a depression, and so forth. When the people who run the system, not me, not Peter Schiff, not Jim Rickards, not all these guys, the doomsday sayers, say it, but when you hear it from the horse's mouth, you should listen, and you should be very careful about having money in the bank. You should be owning hard assets, because when the IMF says that we're heading for what looks like a collapse, it is certain to come.
IMF, just for those who don't know it, what is their role? I mean, one thing is what their real role is. You can say that too. But what's their alleged role in this?
Well, it's the International Monetary Fund who really has an opinion about just about every economy in the world, and they are involved together with the World Bank in underdeveloped countries and third world countries and so forth. And the purpose, of course, together with the United Nations, is not really to help poor countries. It's quite the opposite. But also here we're living under
to enslave them, right?
Well, it's a very sophisticated way of enslaving people and countries. You go in and to a poor country and you say, we're coming here to save you. Here's all this money that you can lend from us. Now, all that money that is being lent to them is, of course, going back to pay the big corporations that the same people own or control, or their friends own and control. And then these countries start getting into serious debt.
Could you say that they are a bank for nation states?
Yeah, I would say so. And,
but what about the World Bank? What's their role then?
Well,
which are their partners in crime? It's always IMF and World Bank.
Well, here we're getting into the sort of space where it's easy to be called a conspiracy theorist, but in my opinion, all this goes back to organizations like the Council of Foreign Relations, ultimately back to organizations like Skull and Bones at the Yale University, and the Council of Foreign Relations have been running things for decades. They're involved in most policy decisions in the States. Some even say they have a big influence over who becomes president. And when the United Nations was created, I think there was something like 72 delegates that represented Council of Foreign Relations.
Yeah, and CFR has also always have people in different governments, and especially American. But they are a think tank, and now you're doing real analysis. I was just, for basic education, for those who don't know what IMF or the World Bank is supposed to do, what's their own claim to existence, let alone the real manipulation of the system, because they are neoliberal vehicles trying to force the Fiat system into a global default. Yes, but so the World Bank loans money to who? To nation states?
Well, I'm not quite sure when you get into the nitty-gritty of it how it's actually done, what the World Bank does and what the IMF does, but they facilitate loans to nation states.
Okay.
At least, yeah.
Okay.
They do.
So, City of London. For those who doesn't know, London as a town or city is divided into several zones. And there is one zone called City of London. So I'm not talking about the entire city of London. I'm talking about just that zone called City of London. What people don't realize, and that this is of course the bank, this is like Wall Street, it's the banksters little state within the state, because people don't realize that they are not following the ordinary rules of England. In fact, the Queen doesn't even have authority in City of London. They are independent, they are above the fray, they are unaccountable. And it's very interesting that it's like the Vatican. It's like the Vatican within Rome, so to speak. So what's going on here? You had an article, I think it was about Joris Liangic, the Guardian journalist who delved into London's finance world. Could you speak a little about the crimes of City of London and what's going on?
Well, I don't think it's much different from what is going on in the rest of the world, and in particular with the Federal Reserve in in America. Yeah, I mean it's the same banking system. It's the same people owning it, and they're conducting the same kind of measures and procedures that they've been doing for a very, very long time. And the level of protection that they have, you have the Vatican City, you have the special street that you're referring to. I hear what you say, but about them not being accountable to anyone, and I believe that to be true. However, I don't know how far that really goes, because it's very difficult to know unless you're allowed into the rabbit hole and you can creep all the way down to the bottom.
Yeah.
But it's the same system almost throughout the whole world. So it's no difference between the City of London with the banksters, or if you go to the Federal Reserve in the States, it's the same. It's the same corruption.
But who would you say are most powerful? Who's most calling the shots? Is it the banksters in Switzerland? Is it the banksters in City of London? Is it Wall Street? Which, as we say in Norwegian, bool, which nest of vipers is the worst here? Or are they all, or can't you divide it by location?
Well, when all of this, if we go back 100 years or so, not even that far, and we look at things that happened back then, for example, when Nikola Tesla invented what he thought was free energy, and his financier was J.P. Morgan, who was heavily into oil and such things. And energy, and
he was actually financing Edison.
Yeah, and he also financed Nikola Tesla. And when he found out that his investments in oil and other, fossil-driven energy sources were in danger because of Nikola Tesla's invention, he retracted all funding for Nikola Tesla, and then a few weeks later, the whole laboratory was burned to the ground. And that was the end of that. And we have similar stories about alternatives to fossil energy that has been tried later as inventions that have had the same kind of fate. So what I'm trying to say is, if you go back in history and you look at that incident and similar incidents, it was easy to see the perpetrator, J.P. Morgan. And now, as this system, banking and the Federal Reserve has been modernized and it's developed over the last 100 years, it's not so easy anymore to point your finger and say he did it. It's not that easy. There are a lot of people going out there and they're saying that, well, the Rothschilds, they control every central bank in the world, and the Rockefellers, they control this and they control that. Yeah, it might be that initially they did, but I think the system has its own sort of life support, and it generates its own, lifeblood, so that it's more difficult now to point at any one person or any one, small group and say they did it. It's not that easy.
I hear there's the superclass is about 6,000 people and 300 families, but I also know that the few investigative journalists left who look into money have a...
Are there any?
Well, they're independent, but they have a very hard time finding who owns what because of this very complex system of conglomerations and cartels and daughter corporations of mother corporations and fake corporations. And so is it conceivable that just a handful of people are owning most of the resources? I know that you have lists like, what's they called? Like the 50 richest people in the world, etc. Those magazines that have that, Fortune 500, stuff like that. But that's like on the end side, accounting side.
Yeah.
If it's a rotten accounting, there's something deeper going on behind. So I always look at those as the rich actors. I'm not saying like people like Orman, Røkke or Fredriksen, they are not rich. I'm just saying they are those who are rich in the white economy, in the white world. But who's really controlling most of the assets? Do you have any notion about this, or is there any way for us to find out in today's system?
Well, back when when Senator Aldrich and Warburg and J.P. Morgan and these guys went down to Jekyll Island back in 1910, it is said that they controlled about 1/6 of the world's wealth at that time.
Wow.
Just those six people. And if they've been in control of the fiat monetary system since 1913, I'm sure that number is higher. You can safely say that. I mean, they're not in the business of doing this to acquire less wealth. And the number that I hear, which I cannot verify at all, because I simply don't know, is that there is about between 45 and 50 sort of top names that pretty much control the important parts of the system. But again, I'm very careful when I say that, because it's very easy to be called a conspiracy theorist these days, as you know.
Yeah,
so, and to me, it really doesn't matter if it's 50 or 6,000. The point is that even 6,000 is a very small number in terms of comparing it to the rest of the world population.
But the conspiracy theory dismissal doesn't work here, because we are talking about a closed system where, per definition, there are, it's in the very nature of the system to have owners who again have owners behind them, who have owners behind them. So no serious person would call a basic analysis of today's corporatism for conspiracy theory. It's just analysis.
No, I agree completely. The reason I agree completely, but I have had these discussions with friends, family, and the business people, business associates, and it's very easy for them to counter, because many people don't like what they hear.
Of course,
it's very easy for them to just go out and call it that. So that is why I'm saying it. I agree, but I agree with you.
Yeah, but they don't have any understanding. They don't have any understanding of how it works. No serious person who knows how so-called capitalism, or I call it corporatism, that we're living under, that if they know how it works, that's what you have to do. So you have to try to find out who owns this, then who owns that, etc. And I disagree with you. I think it does matter how many it is. I totally agree that 6,000 is too few, or 300 families. But if it all boils down to one man controlling 90% of the world, you'll get everyone to admit that doesn't stand. That doesn't. Even the most brainwashed minions of this system who says, no, this is how capitalism is supposed to be. No, it's your own fault, you're poor. No, this one man owns everything. Yeah, he's just better than us and smarter and works harder and whatever. But nobody would say that about just one man. No. They would probably not say it about 10 people. But if you talk about 50,000 people, then they can start to make excuses.
Yes.
So I think it's important, because as soon as they realize it's a handful of people, if they realize that this is the nature of the system, that it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the ownership, and the assets they own gets more and more and more. Eventually you have one man owning everything. Nobody will stand for that. Nobody, not even the most hardcore fascist will stand for that. And that's why I think it's important to wake people up with that's the direction we're going in.
I agree with you. I agree with you, except maybe a clarification on capitalism, because this is not capitalism. It's got nothing to do with capitalism.
No, it's corporatism. Yeah, but people call it that on the left.
Capitalism is just a price mechanism system. It's bringing limited resources, that is labor and capital, to the goods that the masses need. So capitalism is a friend of the masses. It's a friend of the people, but it's gotten a rotten name because it's being associated with these people and with the
criminality.
So people are confused about what capitalism really is, and that is what they want us to believe. Yeah, I'm afraid.
No, but it's true. Every country in the world today have elements of capitalism as well as elements of socialism. There's no pure socialist or pure capitalist system, but what we are suffering under today globally in almost every country is corporatism, where it's kind of the same as Italian fascism back in the day. Only the difference is the fascists were controlling the corporations. Today, the corporations are controlling the state. Otherwise, it's the same rigged marriage. And every isms will suffer under it, including default capitalism and default socialism and whatever other ism you can conceive of. I know libertarians are very fond of saying if we just tried capitalism, we could see if it works.
Well, it really has never been tried, so...
Yeah, and you can also say that about most isms anyway. I don't think they say like, oh, this won't work, that won't work. Everything works. It's just a question of which system, which values do you have? Which system do you want to implement? And they will have different consequences on plus and minus. But there's no system that doesn't work. If there's any system that doesn't work, the closest you get is the current system we're living under now. That really doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
And it's collapsing.
Yeah. And in my opinion, the system we have now was conceived in 1848 when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And that was the start of it. And that's what we're seeing today in the European Union. It's just a continuation of the the world revolution that Marx envisioned for mankind.
Yeah, but Marx envisioned, when he wrote Das Kapital first, it was just a neutral criticism of how the trade or capital system works. Yeah. That was before they launched any suggestions for solutions. But if you go to the suggestions for solutions, like, let's say, the Communist Manifesto, or other spin-offs of that, like Leninism, which is the Russian version of the communism. You see that their goal is to liberate the masses. I'm not saying that's the result. I'm saying that's the idea. Yeah. But if you look at what's going on today in the economic international system, that's not what's going on. They're not trying to make. It's not just that they are incompetent and failing. No, they're trying to rig it so that the masses will be enslaved. So I don't agree that their ultimate philosophy would be communism. I don't see how that would work. Not even corrupt communism. In fact, I think, if anything, what they fear the most is totalitarian state-based systems, whether it's Nazism or communism or whatever, because if the state gets too strong, like we talked about before the interview, if the state is too strong, that's the only thing that could make them accountable. And so that's why they need to control the nation states. I don't see, they have no interest in democratic nation states. That's a threat to them. And I think that's what's going on too, that they're trying to erodate the power, people's power of the nation states. Comment?
Well, this is purely my own subjective opinion, of course.
Sure.
And that is that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, by the way, was financed by Rothschild. And
Engels was a factory director.
Yeah. And no, I think the left today, as it was back in 1848, are being used by the banksters and the people controlling the banking system as a tool or as a pawn in order to have their way, in order to make this sort of like a grandiose new world order or globalism or whatever you want to call it, corporatism. I think that the left, so-called liberals in the States like Kamala Harris and and perhaps Joe Biden. I don't know where he falls in.
Oh yeah, he's a neoliberalist from beginning.
I think Biden will go anywhere where the money leads him.
Yeah.
But Kamala Harris and this Cortez and Black Lives Matter and all of this, who are funded by the Soros Institution, by the way. I think there are tools in the toolkit of the rich people of the world who controls the money system. And I think they're being used because socialism and communism and these isms is an easy way to try to get your will when it comes to power. So I believe the left is being abused or misused or whatever for the purpose.
Hijacked is the word.
Yeah, they're being hijacked, and they don't realize it, and they don't realize the most important thing for them is that if this turns out to be a success for the money elite, they will have no more use for the leftists. They will have no more use for the liberals, and they'll be the first that they'll take care of.
Yeah. I agree with the whole analysis, except I don't really regard the examples you gave as leftists. If anything, they're fake leftists. It's like Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Clinton's, all that stuff. They are neoliberal corporatists.
Yeah, I agree.
And in America, it's really one party. That one party has their people in the DNC and in the RNC. In the same vein, the mainstream Republican politicians are also corporatists, and none of them are like traditional conservative. None of them are traditional socialists or traditional conservatives. In Norway, we have a traditional conservative, Willoch. He reminds me of Ron Paul. But our Prime Minister, Erna Solberg, she's just like any mainstream DNC or RNC representative. They're just neoliberal corporatists, and maybe you could call them centrist.
Yeah.
I look at the real right and the real left as those based in populism. And if you look at the populist right and the populist left, they have lots in common, and one of them is being aware of the elite and how the elite is hijacking the duopoly of American politics. That's just my 5 cents to try to harmonize our paradigms here, because I don't completely agree with the terminology you're using here.
No, maybe I'm being a bit too loose. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But as far as Erna Solberg is concerned, I'm pretty sure that you could throw up an analysis, and the analysis would conclude that she's been hijacked as well.
Yeah, do you think she's aware of it? I mean, to what degree is she aware of her own corruption? We're talking about the Prime Minister of Norway, by the way.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, but why would 7 billion, in money terms, earmarked for the European Union as Norway's fee to the European Union for having access to the market? Why would Erna Solberg insist on twice, both in terms of giving it to Poland and to, I think it was Hungary, in 2017 and then again in 2000? Why would she insist that money not go to the purpose that the Polish and the Hungarian government wanted that money to go? Why would she insist that the money be given to a Soros-controlled institution? Why would she do that? There's something fishy about that, in my opinion. And then again, if you talk about what happened with the Clinton Foundation, right before Børge Brende stepped down as minister, I guess foreign minister of Norway, he made sure to give a few 100 million kroners to the Clinton Foundation. And in my opinion, he was rewarded a directorship at the World Economic Forum.
Yeah.
So what happens later in 2017 was that Brende and Erna Solberg, our prime minister, they got together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they established CEPI, which is located in Oslo and which is at the head of this efforts to find a vaccination for this so-called pandemic that we have. And if you something to say, if you want to see how bad this is, you got to follow the money.
Yeah.
And if you want to find out if Erna Solberg is hijacked and how corrupt she is, you have to follow the money. And if you follow the money, Well, it gives you the conclusion, doesn't it?
Yep. And I totally agree. And this is, if you want to know how corrupt it is, you have to get, I'm talking to the listeners now, you have to get your ass down from the partisan, tribal, hack mentality, because that's created to keep you in an internal prison, because as long as they can play the left against the right, they can continue. Just to explain how rotten this is, the government we have here is so-called conservative. It's not the Social Democrats. They would do exactly the same, of course. But this is a conservative government, and they are paying the Clintons, they are paying the Bill and Linda Gates Foundation, they're paying the game, the banksters game, the corporations. So they are in both parties, and the way to understand, to liberate ourselves is to, in my view, to get rid of the old paradigm of left-right. We should really look at centralism versus freedom, or autonomy on the one hand, and this centralism on the other hand. As soon as you put on those glasses, you can see clearly. You can see clearly what's going on. You can see which voices all over the political spectrum that you can trust, and which voices you cannot. And sometimes, just sometimes, the divide and rule tactic fails, and people coalesce, despite wings, like against the wars, because everybody understands nobody earns on the wars, so the left and the right find common ground. They can do it with the banksters, defending our civil rights and freedoms. They can do it on many areas, but then you have to not be hypnotized by the left-right thing, and that's why we have elections like Clinton versus Trump, or Biden versus Trump, because as long as we have to choose the so-called lesser of two evils, we're trapped in a system of two evils. And the real truth is, those evils, nobody's lesser. They are exactly the same, and they'll just get worse for every election. So I'm kind of glad our country still has more than two options in terms of parties.
Well, I stopped voting years ago because we have an indirect democracy, constitutional democracy in Norway, which means that we vote for the people that rule us, is essentially what it means.
Yeah, we vote for the people who vote.
And what's so great about the majority rule? I fail to see it.
Right.
And besides that, if you take the number of eligible voters in Norway, which is a small country, and you divide your vote into that, you see what kind of influence you really have. So
it's true. It's true.
I don't know.
No, but of course, parliamentarism is not a solution for anything. In fact, you influence the world more through other types of actions and activities, or activism. For example, money. Money is what's really making the world go round. So people power is visible when, for example, they crowdsource something that the system is not interested in. Mm-hmm. But it's being paid from the bottom up. So there are ways here. Mm-hmm. But there is another concept I want your view on, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with what's called a black economy.
Well, a black economy in the sense that it's used for illegal
kind of
trading.
But not your housewife who hires an au pair, or like a typical Norwegian get a Polish painter or something. Not that kind of black economy. I'm talking about on the top of the system.
Okay.
Like there is, we've had, under Bush 1, mm-hmm. He had a housing commissioner, and she also became secretary of housing, called Catherine Austin Fitz. Now, yeah. I've had her on for this and a couple of others, and she blew the whistle already back then. I mean, she was, the housing bubble, all that stuff. She was a part of that process before it happened. And like, one of the problems with analysis of modern economics is that they are not accounting for the black economy. So there is this notion that I think actually now the black economy is bigger than the white.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it involves CIAs, drug things, illegal weapon, monetary weapon industry, all that. But the biggest element in the black economy is that it's like a hole in the white economy where lots of money is being flushed out. And that's a fact, but then you can discuss what is it being used for. Many people think it's just to enrich themselves, but it's beyond what they can spend. They can't spend this money on anything normal, like a yacht or whatever. So the idea here is that it's financing what's called a classified space program.
Okay.
Now, the classified space program, of course, goes back probably to the end of the Second World War, but got boosted under Reagan. You know, the SDI.
Yeah.
And now Trump has kind of tried to whitewash it by introducing the Space Force. But the idea is that they've had and always have lots of advanced technology in the military area. And what we let know is when it's old, like let's say they launch a new airplane. Well, that's after it's been around for 20 years or something. So we're always behind on the innovations.
Yeah.
So the idea here, they have this classified space program that they've been pumping money into. And like that's the only thing that can explain the whole black economy. Now, let's say for the sake of argument, something like that was going on. Can you make that fit your current economic paradigm? Does that explain a couple of things?
Well, there was a professor, I forget at which university he's at, but about a year and a half or 2 years ago, that actually went out and blew the whistle on 21 trillion US dollars that disappeared from through the.
That's right. Hang on. This man is Dr. Mark Skidmore, and he got.
Yeah, that's it.
The reason he was involved is because he wanted to disprove Catherine Fitt's claim and her. It's not just claims. She's been working with this, researching this for 30 years now. So he went into it to disprove her. He got shocked and ended up being her best backup. So yeah, but now the real number is up to 50 trillion. That's the latest number of missing money, or not just missing money, but missing on both sides of the equation, plus and minus. So it's like missing accounting, basically.
Yeah. No, it's the numbers are huge and they're real, and it makes you wonder what has become of a democracy and the rule of law. Because you wouldn't, no real democratic system or a people's government would allow that to happen and, just let it slide, so to speak. So, but this is the situation we're in. I mean, people are either afraid to talk out or they're too apathetic to do anything about it. And I don't know what happened to this, what was his name again? The guy who... Skidmore. I don't know what happened to his report, because he was supposed to publish his final report like at least a year ago, and I've heard nothing about it. So I wonder whether he's been silenced or they...
No, I don't think he's silenced. The latest I heard is that what happened was that they first published something, then they had all the references was taken down because they were referencing to government websites, right? All those were taken down, like we're cleaning up or something. And then they went out with that, and then it came back up. But the thing is, they had already taken hard copies, so they had their own backup servers because they knew that would happen. So I think it's out there. You could Google missing money, or I think I sent you a link to the show with her where I put in links to their work. Yeah. So I think it's out there, but it's not getting any press. It's not getting any traction. I think the last thing that happened was that somehow Ocasio-Cortez came over this, and of course, being a lefty, she wanted to argue that, look, they're taking 50 trillions in their own pockets instead of using it for, healthcare, whatever we want, right? And then she got a huge backlash because of the excuse story. The excuse story is that it's it's an accounting error. But RT and a news outlet I love have a guy called, what's his name again? a young comedian who has a very good show there, and he's been on this case all the time.
Yeah, I know the guy with the long black hair, right?
Yeah. What's his name again? Do you remember?
I forget, but he's pretty funny, but he's also pretty serious.
Oh yeah, great man. Oh, Lee Camp. Lee Camp.
Yeah. But your question was if that fits in with well, if you can create currency, credit, by typing 10 or 15 digits into a computer, who's to stop you from creating $21 trillion or $50 trillion for a space program if that's what they're doing? No one can stop that. It's
But couldn't it explain why they are sticking to fiat? Because if they were sticking to gold, they couldn't get away with it. It would be traceable, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, gold keeps politicians honest and the political system honest.
Right.
And fiat does not. With fiat, you have all kinds of possibilities of, dodging the system, creating credit all over the world. And keeping it hidden from the public as well, if that's what you want to do.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. So that's an incentive for them to keep the fiat system. And it's also, that's why I'm also talking about connecting money to resources, because it seems to me, if everything is like you've explained it, then on the one hand, they're printing as crazy. On the other hand, they are slushing 50 trillions into this venture. And that means that really what they're doing is they're devaluating the value of the white resources. That means your production, my production, what we're doing here is getting less worth. They're like skimming. They're like vampires sucking resources out and putting it into this black project via the fiat system. Is that a correct analysis or understanding?
It's accurate enough. And of course you have, with the fiat system, you also have you're watering out the value of the money system or the currency system, and you're creating inflation, so that the dollar bill you put into your account today is worth $94 next year. Because let's face it, inflation is not 1 or 2%. Not in Norway, not in the United States. They faked those equations about inflation a long time ago. If you go to Shadow Stats or any of these other bureaus that do it properly, you will find out that the inflation rate is in Norway is more like 10%. So
but they say, like one of the guys I had on, he said that you only get inflation if you spend the resources in addition, which we're not consuming as much resources as we are printing money. So in other words, instead of in a locked gold-backed system, inflation immediately. But with a fiat system, they can just spend and spend and spend, and then the inflation will be determined of how much this spending is signalizing a consumption of resources. If it's just money on the top of the system, hedge funds and stocks and all that stuff, it won't reach the grounds.
It won't reach the real economy. You're precisely right. And you have to make a very important distinction. Inflation is an expansion of the money supply, okay? And it can only be done by the central bank. Now, what we are talking about here is price inflation. And price inflation is the result of money inflation, and the inflation of the money supply. So you have to make that distinction, and the one is the result of the other. Price inflation comes from inflating the money supply. So that's what they're doing, and of course the money supply being expanded and the credit issued by the banks as an extension of the money supply growing, it's when that credit comes into the real economy that you see price inflation. That's when price inflation takes hold.
But if they slush lots of, like 50 trillion into a black project, wouldn't that kind of prevent the inflation or at least slow it a little down?
Well, what was it you called it? You called it
a black project, like classified space program. Like off the books. It's not a part of the white economy. So on the one hand, they are printing a lot of money. On the other hand, they are funneling it into a black project.
Well, if you are in charge of the money printing system, there's nothing stopping you from having sort of off-balance sheet, if you will,
Exactly.
system beside the ordinary system, and just funneling that money into a black project, if you will, or any other project, if it's a space project or whatever it is. You can do that. You don't have to tell anybody about it, because what are you really doing? You're just typing some numbers into computer screen.
Yeah, but I mean, wouldn't that kind of slow down? I mean, we would notice it from inflation. So wouldn't that kind of slow down inflation and make the scheme prolonged?
Not necessarily, because it's a dedicated program. It goes into one project, and the project is hidden from the public.
Right.
Yeah. So not necessarily.
Okay, I don't understand. Why is that not necessarily?
Well, I haven't.
Because here's how I view it: money in, printing press; money out, black project. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of using the white economy to whitewash. Mm-hmm. And finance. So I'm thinking that's a way to prevent the worst. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it prevents the worst. It would be better if the inflation was obvious, so people would rise up, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a way to cover it up, isn't it? That's how I understand it, but I'm not an expert. I need people like you to explain it to me.
Well, in that particular instance with the 21 trillion or the 50 trillion, I don't really have a better explanation than our discussion now. And I haven't seen what's her name, Catherine
Fitz. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that she has been given a lot of trouble for having exposed the system. She's been fighting in court, I know.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah, she makes your case look like a cakewalk.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct. But I haven't followed it closely enough, and I don't know enough about it to be absolutely adamant on what's going on here.
No, but it's not even, it's just the principle of it. I'm just saying, if you not just print a lot of money, but you also have an outlet for that money. I'm just trying to understand, wouldn't that prevent inflation? In my thinking it would, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you could explain why it wouldn't prevent inflation.
Well, in order for an expansion of the money supply to create inflation, you would have to somehow bring that money into the real economy.
Right.
So if for example, the Federal Reserve, what they're doing now is they're saying we're injecting $3.5 trillion into the economy in order to save the economy from collapse. What they're doing is more psychological than anything else, because the fact that they're saying that they're printing or really typing a number into a computer doesn't mean that money automatically is coming out into the real economy.
Exactly.
It sits with the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And a lot of the money that they have so-called printed, both back in 2008 and now, has not been diverted or sent out into the real economy.
It's just used to pay off debts or to get rid of toxic assets?
Yeah. Yes, they take over toxic assets, but a lot of this money never doesn't get out into the real economy. It's not being used. It's more the psychological factor that the Federal Reserve is saying, we're taking care of all this, don't worry. And if they say, the more they say they print, apparently the more relaxed the politicians and the public becomes. But it doesn't mean that money that they print or write in on a computer screen immediately goes out into the real economy. Right. It sits at the Federal Reserve in some computer.
Yeah. Okay,
and then when it does trickle into the economy, it tends to trickle out to the people who that doesn't need it most. It trickles out into what we call Wall Street. Yeah.
Okay, well, by the same token then, if they print, because of the Fiat system, if they can funnel 50 trillion into a black project, that should kind of help the white economy go on without collapsing. Maybe that's why they've been able to go for so long now without collapsing yet, although 2008 and 2020 are collapses, to be sure. Yeah. But like I'm saying, maybe that's part of the reason of why they've managed to extend this fiat system for so long?
No. The main reason why they've been able to extend the fiat system and avoiding a collapse is because they have reduced the interest rates by printing money. They've reduced the demand for money down to bare minimum, so that the interest rate is zero or even negative. That's the only way they can maintain it.
Not for consumers, they ain't. Not for us consumers. We have high interest rates, right? Whose interest rates are you talking about?
Well, first of all, I'm talking about the interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets for the banks to lend in between themselves. Oh. And then of course that has an effect on the interest rate that people pay on their mortgage. I mean, it's a big difference for you and I if we pay 7% to the Norwegian bank on our house as opposed to paying 1.5% or 2%.
That's right. Yeah. I see. Okay. So we're going to take a break now, and we're going to come back in part 2 with your story.
Okay.
And also look at potential solutions.
Yep.
So we take a break now. Oh, one more thing before the break. Could you go into the sabotage business of finance article? Or actually, you know what? I'll be fair. You can do it in part 2 because you make some interesting remarks at the end. First, you analyze the problem and you agree with the author.
Yes.
But then you suggest kind of the opposite of what the author suggests. So that I want to ask you about. He suggests more regulations. You suggest less regulations. I'll give you a chance to explain why that's a solution when we come back in part 2. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.